Hi, welcome to Deep End. My name doesn't matter. Let's dive in. Today I want to talk about Antony, the founder of monastic living, the first monk. He lived in 251 AD to 356 AD, and almost everything we know about him comes from Athanasius. Athanasius was a scholar that we'll look at next time. He's my personal favorite, but Antony is somebody worthy of our attention for a moment. And the question that we want to ponder as we start to think about Antony is, how do you live the gospel-centered life, loving your neighbors, loving community, teaching the gospel to those in the world while remaining separate from the world and pursuing a holy, separate life from the world? So Antony was 18 years old when his parents died. He was born into a wealthy Christian family, and his parents, both his mom and dad, died when he was 18, and he inherited his entire family estate and was given charge over his little sister. So he's 18 years old, and he's going to church faithfully. He's trying to find out what God would have him do. And in this moment of desperation, he's studying the book of Acts, and he reads Acts chapter 4, verse 32 through 37, where it says the Christians were selling what they had and giving their money to the poor and living in common community together. And so he does that. He goes to church pondering this question, and then here's a sermon given by the pastor on the very passage that he was thinking about. So he ends up taking this as a sign from God. He commits his sister to the care of a convent, and or a holy set of women who were separating themselves from the world. And then he himself sells all he owns, and he goes to live in the desert where hermits were. Now, he lived far enough away to where he was separate from people, but close enough to where he could come into town. So it's kind of as if he lived out in the woods. And if you have an area of town where you live in, or if you live in an urban center, he lived out of the urban center and in an area of kind of wooded area, kind of like in a tent. So he was out by himself, but he would frequently come back into town. And he sought a couple things. The first thing he wanted was solitude. He wanted separation from the world. So he wanted to be able to pray and seek God without distraction. So he would go out of the town and he would sit and pray and read and study the Bible. And yes, he did have copies of the Bible, not much. He had a copy of the book of Acts. He had a couple other things that he owned, that his family owned, that he kept, that were scrolls and things that he could read. But he would go out and kind of contemplate God and pray and seek the Lord and fast. And he'd come back into town when he needed, and he'd go back out. And he kind of gained a reputation for being this wise young man who was seeking the Lord. And so people wanted to talk to him. And he got very frustrated with it. So in his solitude, he was unable to find solitude that he wanted. So that's the first thing he wanted, was solitude. The second thing he wanted was holiness. And one of the things he learned very quickly was temptation to sin only grows louder when we seek peace and silence. So when we seek peace and silence, temptation to sin grows louder. In order to combat sin, you must be on the offense against it. You must be aggressively attacking sin in the world, trying to find gospel, trying to preach gospel messages and reach people who are lost and actually be in contact with people. So one of the things that he learned in his going back and forth was that temptation to sin increases when he sought silence and separation from the world. And then finally, he wanted personal growth in seclusion. So he wanted personal growth in seclusion. So he gets frustrated at 18, 19, 20-something years old, gets frustrated, and he decides, I'm done. I'm going away. I'm not going to let anybody see me. And for 20 years, he goes out into the desert and lives in caves. And he doesn't go meet people. He comes into town once in a blue moon to get some food and then go back out. But he is not around people for 20 years. And then after 20 years go by, He's gained this reputation for being a wise hermit in the middle of nowhere, and he comes back into town just to get some supplies and to meet up with people, and he runs into a large crowd of people who want to hear from him. A large group that want to hear from him and want to hear his voice and want to know what's going on. So he begins to teach them willingly, and he teaches them these principles: that solitude is good for those to seek God, for Christians to seek God, but people are going to bother you and temptation is going to increase. Holiness is a necessary pursuit of life, and temptation only grows in silence. So holiness is best accomplished by being on the offense in the Christian faith. And then finally, personal growth is to be used for the purpose of gospel work. Now, after that 20-year period, he comes back to society and he engages the world. He still does his going back and forth thing. He still lives in the desert. He doesn't rejoin society per se, but he joins the world and begins to deal with major issues. Athanasius invites him to sit with him, and Athanasius goes out to him to speak with him, and he joins in the fight against Arianism, that doctrine that said that Jesus was not God. And then his disciples, he disciples Athanasius during that time period after that 20 years. And then he also starts a monastery. The first monastery that we know of, he starts at kind of this monastic community of people who want to live separate lives from the world. But one of the big takeaways that we can learn from Antony is that this separation is valuable only insofar as it increases gospel work. So only insofar as we learn to know who the Lord is, and that increases our gospel ministry. So solitude and personal holiness and separation from the world are to be used for the purpose of engaging that very same world with the truth and the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So he lives to be 105 years old, and he dies with practically nothing to his name. So he lives to be 105, and with nothing really, owning very little, just a few scrolls and a sheepskin jacket, he is sure to tell his followers at the end of his life, one of the last things recorded is, make sure that Athanasius gets my sheepskin coat, which is this incredible picture of passing the mantle from the hermit monk to the scholar pastor in Athanasius. So Athanasius is a pastor scholar who is bold and fierce, and at the same time tender and loving, and an excellent pastor. And he has gone out to learn from this hermit, and the hermit who has separated himself from the world says, give him my cloak, that he would go to war for the gospel. So things we can learn. One, the soul grows strong when physical pleasures are denied. The soul grows stronger when physical pleasures are denied. So in this time of quarantine, I would encourage you to think about fasting. Just in the encouragement of Antony and taking his life lesson there, I would encourage you to try and fast a little bit. Second, less clutter and stuff and activity is good for the soul. Now, in our day and age, there's millions of books about minimalism. That is not what I'm talking about. Though that is valuable and that is part of what I'm talking about, what Antony shows us is that separating yourself from the things of the world and having less is actually good for the soul. Having less material around you, less activity, and less stuff going on is good for the soul. Another way to put it is boredom is the spark of the imagination that inspires the soul to know God. Boredom is the spark of the imagination that inspires the soul to know God. So take some time this week to separate from the world, as it's easy to do right now because you're all in quarantine. So take some time to separate from the world right now and be creative and embrace the truth of Jesus Christ to such an extent that you create glorious works for Christ, that you are learning to engage your neighbors in gospel ministry and do battle temptation in this time period. I love you guys. Take time to breathe and I'll see you next time.